In November 383 AD, along the banks of a river that no longer exists, two armies faced each other across cold water. On the western bank stood perhaps the largest military force assembled in 4th century China. Sources claim anywhere from 600,000 to over 1 million men, though these numbers are certainly inflated. On the eastern bank waited a force of perhaps 80,000 troops, defending a dynasty that had spent decades in retreat. What happened next violated every military principle about numerical superiority. The massive army collapsed, the smaller force won decisively, and the political map of China was redrawn for the next 2 centuries. This is the story of the Battle of Fei River, a clash that demonstrated how empire-building ambitions can unravel in an afternoon.
To understand Fei River, we need to understand 4th century China, which looked nothing like the unified empire we often imagine. The Jin Dynasty had unified China in 280 AD, after the Three Kingdoms period, but that unity lasted barely a generation. By the early 300s, the dynasty was consuming itself through the War of the Eight Princes, a series of succession conflicts that devastated the imperial court and military structure. While Chinese elites fought each other, various non-Han ethnic groups who had been living within or near imperial borders began asserting their own power. What followed was a period historians call the 16 Kingdoms, though the actual number of states varied. Multiple groups, including the Di, Xianbei, Qiang, Jie, and Xiongnu peoples, established their own kingdoms across northern China. The Jin imperial court fled south in 316 AD, re-establishing itself at Jiankang, modern Nanjing, and controlling territory south of the Yangtze River. This southern remnant is called the Eastern Jin Dynasty, to distinguish it from the earlier Western Jin. For decades, northern China fragmented into competing kingdoms, none strong enough to dominate the others for long. The south, meanwhile, survived, but lacked the strength to reconquer the north. Chinese historians sometimes describe this period as barbarians controlling the north, while the legitimate Chinese dynasty held the south. But this oversimplifies a complex ethnic and political reality. Many northern kingdoms incorporated Chinese officials and administrative practices. Many southern Jin officials were themselves descendants of northern refugees. The boundaries between Chinese and non-Chinese were more fluid than later historiography suggests. By the 370s, however, the northern situation had changed dramatically. A state called Former Qin, ruled by the Di ethnic group, had conquered most of its northern rivals. The man who orchestrated this was Fu Jian, who became ruler of Former Qin in 357 AD. Fu Jian came to power through a coup against his cousin, Fu Seng, whose 2-year reign had been marked by arbitrary cruelty and paranoid violence. Fu Jian, by contrast, proved to be a capable administrator. He recruited talent regardless of ethnic background, most notably his prime minister Wang Meng, a Chinese official whose administrative reforms helped stabilize Former Qin's government. Under Wang Meng's guidance, Former Qin established functioning bureaucratic systems, collected taxes efficiently, and maintained military forces that could execute complex campaigns. Between 370 and 376 AD, Former Qin absorbed multiple northern kingdoms. In 370, they destroyed Former Yan, a Xianbei state. In 373, they seized control of Sichuan from Jin. In 376, they conquered Former Lian and the Kingdom of Dai. By the end of this expansion, Former Qin controlled all of northern China, the first time since the fall of Western Jin that the north had been unified under a single political authority. This created an asymmetric situation. Former Qin controlled the north with its agricultural resources, larger population base, and the symbolic authority of holding the old imperial capitals. Eastern Jin controlled the south, economically developing but politically fragmented and militarily weaker. The Yangtze River formed a natural defensive barrier, but everyone understood that former Qin's ultimate goal was to cross that river and eliminate Jin entirely. The question wasn't whether former Qin would attempt to conquer the south, but when and how.
In 382 AD, Fu Jian decided the time had come to finish what he'd started. He would invade Jin, cross the Yangtze, and unify China under former Qin rule. Most of his senior advisors opposed this plan. Fu Rong, Fu Jian's brother and one of his most capable generals, argued against it. The Prime Minister and other officials raised practical objections: the logistics of moving such a large force, the difficulty of river crossings against defended positions, the risk of overextension. Some officials, particularly those of Chinese ethnicity, questioned whether the diverse ethnic composition of former Qin's army, which included Di, Qiang, Xianbei troops, along with Chinese units from conquered territories, would hold together under stress. Fu Jian overrode these objections. Sources record his famous boast that his army was so large that if every soldier threw his whip into the Yangtze River, they could stop its flow. This line is often quoted to illustrate his confidence, but it also suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of military operations. Numbers alone don't determine outcomes. Two generals did support the invasion: Muron Chui and Yao Chang. Both were former enemies who had been defeated by Fu Jian, but then incorporated into former Qin's command structure. Muron Chui had been a prince of former Yan before its conquest. Yao Chang came from a Qiang background. Their support for the campaign might seem puzzling. Why would former enemies advocate for their conqueror's expansion? The most likely explanation is that they calculated a successful conquest would elevate their positions, while failure might create opportunities for independence. Both calculations would prove correct, though not in ways Fu Jian anticipated. The mobilization was massive. Sources claim Fu Jian conscripted 6 out of every 10 able-bodied men in former Qin territory. These figures are certainly exaggerated. No pre-modern state could mobilize such a percentage of its male population without economic collapse. But the scale was clearly unprecedented for the period. Former Qin assembled troops from all its conquered territories, creating an army that was ethnically diverse but perhaps not well integrated. In August 383 AD, Fu Rong led an advance force south. Sources claim 250,000 to 300,000 men. Fu Jian followed with the main force, reportedly 270,000 cavalry and 600,000 infantry, though these figures are implausible. A more realistic estimate might put the total former Qin force at 200,000 to 400,000, still enormous by the standards of the time. The invasion strategy targeted multiple axes. One column would advance through Sichuan. The main thrust would aim for Shortshan on the Huai River, then advance toward the Yangtze and ultimately Jiankang, the Jin capital. The Jin court's response mixed panic with determination. Emperor Sima Yao, the nominal ruler, had limited personal authority. Real power lay with various generals and aristocratic families. The Sher family, one of the most prominent southern clans, took the lead in organizing resistance. Sher An served as prime minister. Though he had no military experience, he possessed political skill and remained remarkably calm under pressure. His nephew, Sher Suan, commanded the most effective Jin military force, the Beifu army. This unit had been recruited from refugees in the northeastern frontier regions and had developed a reputation for discipline and effectiveness. In 379 AD, Sher Suan had defeated former Qin forces at Pengcheng, providing Jin with its first significant victory in years.
Jin's military response put Xie An's brother, in overall command of the defensive forces, with Xie Xuan leading the main combat troops. Jin also had Huan Chong defending the western approaches. The total Jin force probably numbered around 80,000 men, outnumbered certainly, but defending familiar terrain with motivated troops. One other figure would play a critical role: Zhu Shu. He was a Jin general who had been captured when former Qin took Shangyan in 379. Fu Jian treated him well and tried to recruit him, but Zhu Shu remained loyal to Jin. Fu Jian apparently misread this loyalty as pragmatic acceptance and sent Zhu Shu as an envoy to persuade the Jin commanders to surrender. This decision would prove catastrophic.
In October 383, former Qin forces captured Shaoyang, an important Jin city. Fu Jian, seeing an opportunity for rapid victory, left his main force at Shangsheng and rushed forward with 8,000 light cavalry to join Fu Rong's advance units. When Fu Jian sent Zhu Su to the Jin camp to demand surrender, Zhu Su instead told Xie Shi and Xie Xuan exactly what they needed to know. The entire former Qin force hadn't yet arrived. If Jin could defeat the advance elements quickly, they might disrupt former Qin's operational timeline and damage morale. Zhu Su's intelligence fundamentally changed Jin's strategic approach. Acting on this information, Xie Xuan and Liu Laoji, one of his subordinate commanders, led 5,000 elite troops against the advanced former Qin position. The attack succeeded dramatically. Sources claim they killed 15,000 former Qin soldiers and several commanders, including Liang Sheng and Wang Yang. This number is probably inflated, but the psychological impact was real. Former Qin forces, expecting an easy campaign against a weaker enemy, had instead suffered a sharp defeat. After this engagement, Jin forces deployed in wide formations along the eastern bank of the Fei River. This created an optical illusion. From a distance, the Jin formations appeared much larger than they actually were. Fu Jian, viewing Jin positions from high ground, saw what he thought was a massive army and significantly overestimated Jin's strength. By November, the two armies faced each other across the Fei River. The river no longer exists. It probably flowed through what is now Luan, in Anhui province, near the Huai River. At the time, it formed a natural barrier. Former Qin forces occupied the western bank. Jin forces held the eastern bank. This created a tactical problem for both sides. River crossings under fire are among the most difficult military operations. Troops wading or boating across water are vulnerable, disorganized, and unable to fight effectively until they reach the far bank. Cavalry loses its mobility. Command and control becomes nearly impossible. For Jin, attacking across the river against a larger force would be suicidal. For former Qin, crossing against prepared defenses would be costly even with numerical superiority. The stalemate favored Jin, which was defending. Time allowed Jin to concentrate forces, improve positions, and wait for Qin's logistics to strain. Former Qin needed either to find an undefended crossing point, wait for reinforcements that would allow overwhelming force, or somehow force Jin to abandon their defensive position. Xie Xuan proposed a solution that seems counterintuitive. He sent a message to Fu Rong, suggesting that former Qin forces retreat slightly from the river's edge, allowing Jin troops to cross unopposed. Once Jin forces had crossed, both armies could meet on open ground for a proper battle. Most former Qin generals recognized this as absurd. Why would they give up their position and create tactical complications for no clear benefit? But Fu Jian saw an opportunity. If former Qin troops pulled back from the river, Jin forces would begin crossing. While Jin was split, half across, half still crossing, former Qin could attack and destroy the divided enemy. It would be a tactical masterstroke.
What happened next demonstrated how battlefield chaos can overwhelm careful planning. As former Qin troops began pulling back from the river's edge, confusion spread through the ranks. The army was enormous, multilingual, composed of units from different ethnic backgrounds with varying degrees of loyalty to former Qin, that the Qin army had been defeated. Other sources suggest Jin agents may have spread similar rumors. Whether orchestrated by Jin or emerging spontaneously from confusion, the effect was devastating. Soldiers in the rear, unable to see what was happening at the front, heard that former Qin was defeated and panicked. The retreat turned into a rout. Units that had been moving backward in order began running. Once panic spreads in a large military formation, it becomes almost impossible to stop. Officers lost control of their men. Different units, not understanding what was happening, began moving in different directions. The careful formation of a large army dissolved into thousands of individuals trying to figure out what to do. Fu Reng, the commanding general, and Fu Jian's brother, tried to halt the collapse. He rode forward, attempting to rally troops and re-establish order. According to sources, his horse suddenly fell. Before he could recover, Jin soldiers reached him and killed him. The death of the commanding general removed whatever slim chance remained of restoring order. Xie Xuan, seeing the former Qin forces in disarray, immediately launched an attack. He crossed the Fei River with his forces, no longer opposed, and began attacking former Qin units that were scattered, disorganized, and trying to retreat. Other Jin generals, including Xie Yan and Huang Yi, joined the assault. What might have been a difficult river crossing turned into a pursuit of broken enemy forces. Former Qin troops abandoned equipment, supplies, and positions as they fled. The chaos was such that soldiers literally trampled each other trying to escape. Some drowned trying to cross rivers. Others died from exposure as they fled through cold November weather without adequate supplies. Fu Jian himself was wounded, sources say by an arrow, and barely escaped. He fled north, protected by Murong Chui's troops, which maintained some discipline even as the rest of the army collapsed. Sources claim 70–80% of former Qin's forces were killed, though this probably conflates combat deaths with those who died during the chaotic retreat from starvation, exposure, and injury. The battle itself probably lasted only a few hours. The pursuit and the disintegration of former Qin's army continued for days.
The immediate consequences were clear. Former Qin's invasion had failed catastrophically. Jin had won a defensive victory against a much larger force. But the longer-term consequences proved even more significant. Former Qin's defeat triggered immediate political disintegration. Murong Chui, who had escorted Fu Jian to safety, asked permission to lead forces east to suppress rebellions. Fu Jian agreed. Instead, Murong Chui declared independence in early 384 and began rebuilding the state of Yan, which former Qin had conquered years earlier. This became later Yan. Other generals followed Murong Chui's example. Yao Chang, the Qiang general, rebelled north of the Wei River and established later Qin. Murong Hong, Murong Chui's nephew, revolted near Chang'an and founded Western Yan. The Qifu tribe established Western Qin in 385. Liu Guang, returning from a successful campaign in the western regions, found former Qin collapsing and established later Liang in the northwest. Former Qin's northern empire, unified just 7 years earlier, fractured into multiple competing states within 2 years. The ethnic divisions that Fu Jian's administration had managed to contain burst open. Various groups that had been conquered and incorporated into former Qin took the opportunity to reassert independence. Fu Jian himself was besieged in Chang'an by Western Yan forces. Food shortages forced him to flee in 385. He was captured by Yao Chang, who tried to convince him to ceremonially transfer power. Fu Jian refused and was strangled on Yao Chang's orders later that year. Even Yao Chang's soldiers reportedly mourned Fu Jian, suggesting he had been respected as a ruler despite the military disaster. Former Qin continued to exist nominally until 394, but it was essentially over after Fei River. What had been China's first unified northern state since the fall of Western Jin disintegrated back into competing kingdoms. For Jin, the victory provided a reprieve, but not a solution. Xie Xuan led forces north and recovered territories south of the Yellow River, expanding Jin's control back into the Central Plains. But Jin was unable to capitalize fully on former Qin's collapse. Internal political divisions, competition between aristocratic families, and limited resources prevented Jin from reconquering the north. Xian died in 385, removing the political figure who had organized the defense. Xie Xuan retired from active campaigning shortly after. Without their leadership, Jin's momentum stalled. The dynasty would survive until 420, but it never managed to reunify China. The north remained divided among multiple kingdoms. The southern and northern dynasties period was just beginning. This division between north and south would persist until 589, when the Sui dynasty finally reunified China.